All right, thank you all for joining us for our 4th of July programming here at the Frontier Culture Museum. My name is Mary Kate Clater. I'm the Associate Director of Interpretation here at the museum.
My name is Misty Furr, and I'm a historic interpreter and museum educator at the museum.
And joining us today, we're really happy to have Victoria Ferguson. She is a member of the Monacan Indian Nation of Virginia and is also the manager of the Monacan Indian Living History exhibit at Natural Bridge State Park. And what we're going to be talking a little bit about today is kind of the foundations of everything that's leading up to the American Revolution in regards to American Indian people, and how actually a lot of some of the language that's used in the Declaration, how that has a legacy that still affects a lot of American Indian people to this day. So Vicki, if you could just kind of get us started telling us a little bit about your background and your work in historical interpretation, that would be great.
Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Victoria Persinger Ferguson, and I have been a historical interpreter for well over 20 years. I started as a volunteer as a historical interpreter when I moved to Roanoke, Virginia. And the reason why I did that is I was volunteering at a place called Virginia's Explore Park. They were doing programming about Virginia Indians from this part of Virginia. And I realized that because I am a descendant of the people from this part of Virginia, how important it would be to have a descendant there to help guide the narratives and help to tell the stories that we would want to have told about us. So I started volunteering there, and I really liked what I was doing so much until I decided to just focus on it. It became a passion, and it's something that, as you can see, I'm still doing today. So I've been doing it for a while, and thank you guys for inviting me to speak from the Virginia Indians' perspective as we do this 4th of July presentation that we're working on today. So if you guys have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them for you today.
Absolutely, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Misty, did you want to kind of get us started a little bit with some of the historical context?
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to start out too with a quick quote from Mark Charles, and I can include a link about some of his background. He is Diné Navajo, and this really struck me as kind of awesome, because as we're having this whole conversation, not just between us, but everyone everywhere is talking about this right now. Many of us have been talking about it for a while. But I like this quote. It just says, as a nation, the United States of America does not share a common memory, and therefore struggles to have true community. So this concept of this common memory, if we're starting looking at the events going just prior to the American Revolution, and if we're saying that the Declaration of Independence is this important founding document, which it is, we need to acknowledge that not all of the words in that document are representative of a true community or of a common memory, because it's from a particular viewpoint. So if we start the discussion following or focusing on the events just prior to the American Revolution, and if we're celebrating this as this Declaration of Independence, we need to acknowledge that the words "all men are created equal" do not, in fact, mean all men. And that the ideals of the revolution, these are ideals that for the people whose lands were ultimately now the United States of America, those ideals weren't realized at the founding. So if we just look a mere 30 lines into the Declaration of Independence, or a mere 30 lines after those words, "all men are created equal," we see that the Declaration basically reduced hundreds of diverse nations to merciless Indian savages. And these are the words used by the founders to describe, you know, what they feel is part of why they need to declare independence. So the Declaration, as we all know, is just a list of problems that they have with the king, right? So they say that the king has, you know, basically, and I'm reading this there, the king has endeavored to bring to the frontier these merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Mm-hmm. In reality, these signers are basically talking about not being able to settle lands that they're major investors in. So if we back up before the revolution and go back to the end of the French and Indian War, the Declaration of 1763 is really what they're complaining about in this whole thing of, oh, they're bringing, you know, they say that they're bringing the savages to them. No, they're not. They're not being brought to the frontier. Those frontiersmen are going into native lands and actively ignoring the law, the rule of law, where the king had declared those lands off limits. And that's not by any stretch of the means or by any stretch of the imagination some kind of moral statement that the king is making. Don't settle those lands because it's not right. It's practical. They had just gone 30 million pounds sterling into debt protecting these colonists from the French and the tribes in the Great Lakes. It's kind of disingenuous to say in that language that they're using that these people are coming to their lands. No, they're not. They're going to those lands. Mm-hmm. So
where they were already living.
Where they were already living.
Yeah.
And you know, to basically like look at the reality of it is that they want to settle those lands. In fact, it's not just, you know, the major players like Jefferson or Washington who were major land speculators. It's kind of a general feeling amongst a lot of the colonists. In fact, there's a kind of a quote that sort of distills all of that into, you know, one little statement. In the Virginia Gazette in November of 1763, someone writes to the Gazette, not even a second Chinese wall, unless guarded by a million soldiers, could prevent the settlement of the lands on the Ohio and its dependencies. This is in 1763. Now, in 1768, the Cherokee and the Southern Indian agent for the Crown, John Stuart, signed the Treaty of Hard Labor, which, and you know, they're trying to get the Crown to protect lands like Kentucky. At the same time, the colonists in Virginia sign a treaty with the northern agent, William Johnson, who, along with the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, sell those lands in Kentucky to Virginia. None of that land belongs to the Haudenosaunee, but the Virginians are trying to circumvent the law, the law of the land, and settle these lands that, you know, they're not supposed to be settling on. So when we look at the really the beginning of the Declaration, a lot of it has to do with this desire to take land that really doesn't belong to them and to break the law.
It continues to push forward the stolen land, stolen people issue that was going on, and you have to look at who controls the narrative when history is written that way. We do celebrate the Declaration of Independence, and I'll say that I don't really know what it would have been like to live during that time period. We work as reenactors and historians to try to understand it. But when you look at, even in Virginia, when tribes like our tribes had signed treaties with the English, and parts of the treaty were kept, but huge parts of the treaty were not kept. So I'm thinking my ancestors are understanding very well that you can't trust the English but so much. So when the opportunity came, Monacan Indians who are living in the middle portion of Virginia are found to be siding with the colonists to get rid of England. I mean, our track record with England wasn't great. My fourth great grandfather fought at the Battle of Yorktown, and he fought under General George Washington and General Lafayette. And one of the first grandsons born after that was named George Washington Lafayette Penn. And within our cultures, we would tend to name children names that we thought were powerful names. So I could understand why this grandson ended up with that huge name that he ended up with. But for some of our tribes, we are fighting along with the colonists. Our track record with England had not been a good track record. If you look at the broken treaties, the issues with taking land, you know, as I said, stolen land with stolen people, and even early on, natives were stolen. I mean, we signed treaties that said that Virginia Indians could not be used as slaves or in servitude. So that lets you know that there was a problem with that amongst even Virginia Indians. So we are looking at the reality of what our ancestors were going through and why different groups of people are choosing to take different sides as we looked at that declaration. Whenever you see the term merciless Indian savages, and you know, oh, how terrible of them, you know, because they fight to kill. Yeah, I still see that going on today, by the way, with battles and wars that we're fighting. But you're fighting for your land. You're fighting for your life. You're fighting for your family, your culture. You're fighting for your very existence. And I understand why groups of Native people fought so hard. You know, it was our land. We're fighting for our land. People ask us today, why would Native Americans fight for the United States? Why do you all do that? And the reality of it is, it's our land. We're fighting for our land. But not only that, the idea of being a warrior has long been established as something that's important within our tribes. And so when you look at all of my uncles and my sons and my husband, and all these people who have fought, for my son, it was a badge of courage to be able to say, I have become a warrior. I can now do a warrior's dance and be seen as a warrior. And so those little teeny parts of the culture that remain are still important parts to us. But as Misty said, merciless, savage Indians, you fight to protect what you believe is yours, as long as you believe it's yours.
Mm-hmm. And something else kind of along that same vein that some of you all might not be aware of is that American Indian people are not granted actual citizenship until 1924. Right. And the thing is they've served in every single military conflict we have had as a nation since the American Revolution, and they serve at a higher rate than any other demographic.
Yes, per capita, yes.
Yeah, so that's something that's very, very important to a lot of indigenous people in this country.
And that role is expanded beyond, in the Native communities, beyond men to women warriors as well.
Yes.
And I'd been reading that they actually have a really, many Native communities have ceremonies or important services welcoming their warriors back into their community, which
Right.
in many ways, those who focus on like PTSD for vets are studying what the different Native cultures are doing in respect to that, because it's it's an important way to welcome those warriors back into their community.
Mhm. And kind of, if we're sort of leading into more of the legacy of that phrasing in the Declaration of merciless Indian savages, it's something that sort of it's like a domino effect of how a lot of Native people are treated in the time after the revolution too. So one thing is after George Washington begins his presidency, one of the things that he's really adamant about is implementing these civilization policies, where essentially the idea hasn't really changed. It's been this way even before the revolution. But the idea of either indigenous people either need to assimilate or they need to go somewhere else. If they're not able to intermingle and essentially become like the rest of the broader culture, then it's not going to work. That relationship is not going to work. So you start that, or you see that really starting with George Washington, even leading into Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. That's one thing that's always kind of interesting to me, is when you think about learning about the Louisiana Purchase in, say, elementary school, you just think, oh, it was this deal between Thomas Jefferson and France. He just bought this big chunk of land and now we're an even bigger country. But that completely removes the fact that there were huge amounts of indigenous people that were in that area, all the way to the Rocky Mountains, that were affected by this. That's not considered their land anymore. So that's kind of the Louisiana Purchase is sort of one of the first really big stages of that really broad removal of American Indian people. And then, of course, as we go into the 19th century, you have people like Andrew Jackson, who's spearheading things like the Indian Removal Acts in 1830. And I actually have a quote from him from his speech that he made to Congress, going in support of this act. And he says, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all of the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all of the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion." So by that logic that he had, is that the only way that we can be considered prosperous, the only way that we can be considered civilized, is to have those things that he just mentioned. And since, in his opinion, American Indian people either didn't have that or were not capable of that, they could not be a part of it.
And I find that really funny, considering that if we look at most of American history, so-called American history, is Native history. The greater portion of it is Native, after 400 generations of living on this land. And you have cities like Cahokia, granted it's a lot earlier than, the Americas, that has 20,000 people in it. I mean, there's a vast range of living experiences between, the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi for that early, dividing line of the Proclamation Line, and then from the Mississippi to the Pacific. There's a vast number of ways of living, that aren't just a few thousand savages roaming around in the woods. you know.
As you read historical writings, I remember reading one, and it was talking about the Eastern Siouans of the interior portion of Virginia. And one of the things that it said is, well, these people were wiped out before anybody thought to ask them questions about, you know, who they were or how they lived. Of course, they were wiped out is not accurate. And that's why when I read things from history, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about, I have to remember that these are written from the colonizer's point of view. Mm-hmm. And that as I read it, I have to read these things through the eyes of a native person in order to see beyond, read between the lines a lot. And as we study those things, it was advantageous for people to write things like that. Oh, well, it's only a few thousand Indians, you know, or, oh, they were already gone, or these types of things. It was very advantageous for what the dominant culture was trying to do in order to make it seem like we're not really putting that many people off their land. It's not that many. I think the one that bothers me the most is when I hear statements like, well, they're not doing anything with the land anyway. And I'm thinking, because we're the custodians of this place.
Right.
And we understand that if we take care of it, it will take care of us. Now, all of a sudden, you have people who are like, oh, you know, we wish we knew what plants we could use for this or that or the other. Well, you know, you could have known so much more had you not adopted we're the dominant culture, and, you know, you few thousand people don't matter, and the way you lived, it doesn't matter. So which one is it? Are they groups of merciless, savage Indians, or is it only 1,000 of them? Which narrative should we believe?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, to me, that goes right back to that whole, you don't have community if you don't have common memory. So if we're wiping out most of the common memory by only focusing on the words written by people for the various reasons that you point out, you know, I mean, there's obviously, we're not in a 17th or 18th or 19th century mindset because we're 21st century people, but
right.
You know.
Well, we're actually going to wrap up this first section. This is part one of our discussion, and we're going to resume with part two to kind of talk about, recap the issues we just talked about, and then kind of see how they also lead us into the present day as well. So thank you all so much, and we will be starting back again here soon.